they wouldn't have needed to kill me, and by kill me, I'm talking about, say, I'm biased or I'm
Yeah,
making
right.
mistakes, if they had their own evidence base to counter what I had written. And also, you'll notice this. You won't find people saying, the people that I cited, you won't find those people saying I miscited their studies. That never happened.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things that's really telling as well is that when you, for example, I noticed in the beginning of your book, you talked about how when this book came out, that instead of going after the science that you cite and the information that you're providing in your book, people went after you. I think that that's a very telling thing when somebody goes after somebody personally and, questions their motivations in that instead of questioning the book, because your book is so well researched. It's phenomenal. Is amazing how well researched it is. All you've done is just gone through and looked at you. I feel like, let me ask you this. Do you feel like you went into this with any biases? Because it doesn't feel like that to me. When I read the book, it feels very unbiased. It feels like you're just taking the information, looking at it from, an unbiased perspective. But do you feel like you went into this with any bias when you wrote the book in the first place?
No, not at all. I mean, really, I'm going back to what I said in the beginning, is I had been schooled in evidence-based medicine, and I wanted to ask a simple question. What does the evidence tell us about how this form of care is affecting us over the long term? And that has several elements to it. We had been told, the public had been told, these were validated diseases, okay? In other words, they had the chemical imbalance story is a story of validated diseases. You have this problem, and everybody in this category has that problem. Well, so the point is, if you're going to follow an evidence-based path, you're going to go to the scientific literature. This is the first part, and see, is that story true? Is that chemical imbalance story true? And then what I did in that book, of course, is talk about how the drugs were discovered, okay, because they cause these
Right.
abnormalities in animals. And then also just then looking at where did the chemical imbalance story arise in the scientific literature, then follow, well, what happened when they tried to see if it was true. And then as early as late 1970s, the chemical imbalance story of the dopamine imbalance story of schizophrenia was beginning to fall apart. I told you, like in 1984, the NIMH ran a trial and said, we're just not finding it. So that's not a bias. What is that is being trained to follow the scientific literature. Now, as far as the bigger question you're talking about is how do psychiatric drugs affect long-term outcomes? There's an evidence-based way to address that question. And that is try to figure out what is the natural course of the disorder. And then once you start that, you go say, well, when clinicians who are used to sort of the old course of the disorder began treating their patients with these new drugs, what did they see? And you'll see some clinicians saying in their clinical experience, it seems like my patients, maybe they're getting better a little quicker, but now they're relapsing more frequently. It's causing a chronification of the disorder. And then you just go through the evidence. So what I arrived at this book with, I think, was a plan, a process, an evidence-based process for trying to answer that question. And here's the key thing and this was what you said in the beginning. When I did this, I first said, okay, well, why do they say, for example, that antipsychotics help people long term? Well, they say, they prevent relapse. So I looked at the relapse literature, and you can see that the relapse literature says if you take people who are, basically stabilized well on a drug, say an antipsychotic, which is that's a select group of people, and now you run a study where you withdraw the drug rapidly from half and maintain the other on it, sure, the drug people that are withdrawn is going to relapse at a higher rate. That doesn't tell you anything about long-term functioning, though, or even the natural course of the disorder. What it tells you is don't withdraw the drugs real fast. Okay, that's a problem.
Right.
So
Yes.
my point is, going back to this is when I got done, I said, I really tried to see, did I miss anything where they could cite and say, oh, no, here's the evidence that shows that these drugs are improving long-term outcomes. And I couldn't find it. But nevertheless,
Right.
research is out there. And I was waiting when they got done. If I was wrong, they would say, oh, no, here's our evidence showing that these drugs improve the course of depression. Here's the evidence that shows that it improves the course of schizophrenia, okay? Now, if they had that evidence, that's what they would have pointed out. But they didn't have it.
Right.
And by the way, the evidence I was quoting was NIMH studies. I didn't do the research. They did the research. And so that's why they had to kill the messenger. So,
Yeah.
if they wouldn't have needed to kill me, and by kill me, I'm talking about, say, I'm biased or I'm making mistakes. If they had their own evidence base to counter what I had written. And also, you'll notice this. You won't find people saying, the people that I cited, you won't find those people saying I miscited their studies. That never happened. In other words,
Right.
And what I always did was I took their data and what they said about their own data in those studies. So I wasn't like calling up and asking him. I'm saying, what did you say in your study? And because of that, that was a controversial book, but I didn't have people coming forth and saying I miscited them or I miscited their study. And I didn't have people saying, and this is the research he missed.
Right.
So was I biased? No, I had a plan for following an evidence-based process. That's what I had.
Right. And you do an extraordinary job in this book. I think one of the things that I love the best about it is that a lot of times when you see things about, trying to prove or disprove something, a lot of anecdotes are given, and anecdotes are used as evidence, correct? And so what I loved, but anecdotes are helpful in humanizing data. So when somebody gives only data, then it's really hard to relate to. It's really hard to understand how that applies, how it impacts people. And I love the way that you write your book, because everything is, you start with the history of the psychiatry, you do the history of disorders, how they evolved, diagnoses and that kind of thing. Then you go to the studies and you talk about the medications that were used and what the studies were that led to them being used, or, how they got around studies that showed they weren't effective, those kinds of things. And it's very well researched and very well documented. And then you go to the personal stories. Then you go to how it was actually impacting people. And it is such an impactful way to approach telling this story, because for me, it helped me to understand the science behind it. That was very helpful to me, because like I said, most of us aren't going to go do all this research. Most people don't even know how to do this kind of research for themselves. But then reading the stories, I'm like, that was me. Reading some of these stories, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my story. Because I felt like, this is going to sound silly, but I felt like a crazy person, not just because of my disorder, but because I was constantly questioning what was being done. And it didn't make sense to me. I remember I have a very clear memory of this one day when I was standing in front of my medicine cabinet, taking my medication out to take it, and I started to cry, because I hated taking my medication so much. I hated it. And I kept giving myself pep talks. Every time I would take the medication, I give myself a pep talk. But I had terrible side effects on every medication I took. And the medications the medication cocktail I ended up in the end was about 7 medications. I had 2 that I would take occasionally. But I had my 2 antidepressants. I had a mood stabilizer. I had something to help me sleep, because I was like, couldn't sleep at night. I remember just laying in bed begging God to let me sleep. I had all these different medications I was taking, and I knew they were hurting my body. That was the other piece of it, is I had to go in for liver function tests all the time. And I thought, I don't understand what I'm doing here, because I don't feel any better. I'm taking all these medications. I still am super sick. What's the point of all this?
Yeah,
so, anyway.
No, I think, Michelle, what you're talking about here is really important, is that the personal stories allow the readers to sort of identify, see themselves as an individual within this larger context of research. And you say, yes, this research does tell my story. And I had the same sort of path as this person that Bob is talking about here. And the reason you see it is because that individual story actually reflects the path you see in the research literature so often. So, for example, you said you took an antidepressant, you became manic, right? Well, we know that does happen to many
Right.
people. And many people who would not have gone manic without the antidepressants. And then you said you ended up on 7 drugs? Well, that's often
At
also
the
a
end.
common.
That was right before.
Yeah. But you know what that
Yeah.
tells you? That tells you the drugs didn't work. If the drug works so well,
Right.
why would you need a second drug? Why would you need a third drug? Why would you need a fourth drug? That is telling you, that
Right.
polypharmacy path is telling you of a form of care that doesn't work. And yet, it's amazing to me that psychiatry remains blind to that fact. Oh, well, the person's treatment
Right.
resistant. We'll have to try this and retry that. Maybe you should try taking the drugs away to see if people get better, because obviously your treatment's not working. But that's the blindness that has been present in psychiatry now for like 40 years.